This is Geek Gab with your hosts, John, Brian, and me, Daddy Warpig. We are back. Geek Gab for Saturday, October 28th, 2017. We would like to welcome all of you brave, bold listeners who have turned into hear the show live today. Today's show is future history for fictional purposes. And before we get to our great guest, I want to stop and give my fellow hosts a chance to say hi.
Hi. Hey, everybody. It's been a good week. Looking forward to Gab today. How's it going, Brian?
Oh, it's going better. On the huge pile of work on my desk, so feeling energized. Glad to be back. Sorry for the absence last week, but I had family matter to attend to. That was a lot of fun, and I'm just glad to be here. Glad everyone in the chat's here. Glad our guest is here.
Now, would you like to introduce our guest?
I would love to. Today's guest is scientist, inventor, and author Hans G. Schantz. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, you did.
Outstanding. As another guy with a German and a Teutonic name that can be difficult for these English to pronounce. I stand in solidarity with you. It's how I always know when telemarketers are calling, by the way, when they mingle my name. How about you, Hans?
Oh, I get Schantz all the time.
From people in New Jersey, probably.
Yep.
Which is too bad because it rhymes so well. Why would you ruin that?
Brian, that was a terrible introduction. Terrible. That was just awful.
Thank you.
Ideally speaking, one would, at this point in the show, give some background info so that those who have tuned into the show, who have not necessarily heard about our illustrious guest before, can get up to speed.
I see. So that's the format we're working with.
Yes.
That's why we need. That's why we need cue cards for this.
I would like to get up to speed. Mr. Schantz, I'm not familiar with your work at all.
Well, I'd be happy to introduce myself. I am, my day job is as a scientist, an inventor, and an entrepreneur, where I work for a company that makes indoor location systems. In my spare time, I write books. I've written a nonfiction book on ultra-wideband antennas and decided a few years ago to branch out into science fiction. I've written 2 novels now. My debut novel was The Hidden Truth. It actually got up into the top 10 in alternate history on Amazon. Wow. And the sequel to that is A Rambling Wreck.
Okay, I'm going to derail the show entirely. What the heck is a location system?
An indoor location system is like GPS, but it works indoors. So people or assets you want to keep track of have a little tag associated with them. And we provide a real-time update on where you are. So from a science fiction point of view, it's a bit like looking at the Harry Potter Marauders map and getting to see where all the people on your team are, except that we can calculate the locations and the distance traveled and the velocity and what zones you're in, and do alerts and alarms entirely without use of magic. It's all in software.
What's the distance discrimination on that?
Well, it depends on the application. We have one NHL hockey team that's using it in training, and they're the ones who are probably pulling the most statistical data out of it because they're keeping track of distance traveled in a workout and the velocities of the players. That particular system is actually integrated with biometric sensing, so we can keep track of everyone's heart rate, and you get a really good idea of who's working out and who's recovered from their injury and who's slacking off in practice and so forth. So the coaches really like using it as a training tool.
So I mean, how precise is it? Down to what measurement?
Our mean accuracy is about 40 centimeters or so, about, call it 16 inches. We use a proprietary low frequency technique that uses really long wavelengths. And those long wavelengths do a great job of bending, diffracting around obstructions, so we don't have the kind of blockages that a lot of the higher frequency, more line of sight type location systems would have.
All right. Now, having thoroughly derailed the discussion, your novel that you won best, or that you got in the top 10 alternate history novels, give us a quick description of what it's about.
Sure. It's set in an alternate timeline that is very close to our own, except that when the 9/11 hijackers attacked, they managed to hit the White House and the Capitol instead of the World Trade Center. And in so doing, they killed President Gore. And so President Lieberman and Vice President McCain, in a unity ticket, have taken even more draconian anti-terror surveillance measures than have been taken in our own timeline. But that's really in the background. And the main part of the story is about a young high school student who lives in the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee and discovers an old book with some subtle clues in it that lead him to discover certain aspects of electromagnetics that were discovered 100 years ago have been suppressed and covered up by an evil conspiracy. And of course, in the nature of all good conspiracies, you never ascribe to stupidity what you can ascribe to active malice. So the conspiracy is responsible for a lot of the mistakes and consequences that we see in political life today. So there's a heavy political element to it as well.
Outstanding.
I'm still chuckling to myself at Lieberman. I'm from Connecticut. Yeah. That's been a hilarious joke my whole life.
Thanks for sharing.
Now, everybody in the audience, take a moment and feel bad for Connecticut. Well,
where would no one notice an entire town full of robots? Connecticut.
What? Now, Brian, you had. I'm assuming, I'm concluding, based upon my close reading of the text of the title of the show, that you were going to use the incidences and subjects of this particular novel to illuminate some aspect of creating a novel, writing a novel, and I'm guessing doing the world building for an allohistorical background. Am I missing the boat on that?
No, you are right on target. That's one of the things that Hans and I discussed before the show, and that was his choice of topic. And I mean, you just heard the description of his book. It perfectly dovetails with the idea of world building, sort of using conjectural science, trying to forecast what direction science is going to evolve in, and also looking at the history of technological development. And so, Hans, I'm curious about what particular what's one particular past line of development in technology, and what is one possible future derivative of that that you used in your books?
Well, in my book, what I assume is that I'm actually bringing a lot of my day job into my science fiction. My company uses these low frequency radio waves that work in what's called the near field. So I've had to do a lot of original work understanding how electromagnetics works and how the electromagnetic energy that's bound up in and around an antenna manages to decouple and radiate away. And I came up with some innovative ideas, and when I looked into them further, I was deeply surprised that some of the concepts and models that I've come up with weren't discovered 100 years ago. And you can take a look through the writings of some of the electromagnetic masters, the followers of Maxwell, who took his theory and fleshed it out and developed it where everyone else went and ran with it. And somehow they never quite got to the point of looking at things the way I've managed to come across. And that's really what got me started on this. My starting point was to suppose that, well, perhaps they had, and someone wanted to erase all the evidence. And starting from that premise, then I had to concoct who they might be and why they might be concerned about having this electromagnetic knowledge out there, and what steps they might have taken to cover it up. But really, my approach effectively just cherry picks from stuff that really happened. Like, for instance, the person who developed modern electromagnetic theory, James Clerk Maxwell, died at his prime in his 40s before he really had a chance to flesh out his theories. And I ascribe that to my evil conspiracy. The scientist who first discovered radio waves and did a lot of the critical work to understand how they work and how electromagnetic radiation happens, a German scientist named Heinrich Hertz, he died when he was in his 30s. Another scientist who really anticipated Einstein and was working on a lot of the basic concepts of relativity and showing how they arrive from electromagnetics, an Irish scientist named George Fitzgerald, he died in his 40s as well. So I took those real life facts and wove them into my conspiracy. But I wanted to talk about more than just my book. I wanted to talk more in general about how you go about anticipating history, because most of the historical influenced science fiction really goes about it from 2 points of view. One, the simplest is just a straight linear interp. You take a look at how things are going right now and make a modest interpolation into the future. So, a lot of the classic speculative political novels, 1984 or Brave New World, we're taking a look at the then present day politics and extrapolating it into the future. Or something like Atlas Shrugged, which does that from a political point of view. Or Harry Harrison's Soylent Green, where the idea is the environment's bad, we're making it worse, and how will it be when the environmental apocalypse hits us? Those kinds of interpolations, there's a broad range of science fiction and speculative fiction that addresses those. The Cold War fears, there's classics like Canticle for Leibowitz or Alas, Babylon. So, the simplest kind of, let's use history and predict the future is asking yourself, well, what's the day after tomorrow going to look like? How will the future look if current trends continue? And I actually wanted to see if anyone else had any good examples of science fiction or speculative fiction novels that take that kind of approach.
Yeah, sure. And to boil it down for aspiring writers in the audience, what you're doing is a specialized application of the old rule, which is, how do you come up with a speculative fiction plot or plot conceit? Is you take something mundane and just ask what if about it. And I love how you're doing that about somewhat anomalous or open-ended historical occurrences in the history of science, taking these sort of anomalous early deaths of these great pioneers and ascribing it to a conspiracy. It's just asking, what if the deaths of Hertz and Maxwell were caused by the sinister cabal? So that's great. One example, the husband of a writing teacher of mine is a published author, and I'm trying to think of the name. Can't quite remember the name of the series because this was some years ago, and it was kind of a minor niche cult series, but he was doing historical research, and he found that at some point in the 19th century, later 19th century, Mark Twain and Nikola Tesla shared a carriage ride, like a pretty lengthy one. I don't know if it was all the way across country, but like they were in this carriage together, and he thought, okay, well, they both write in their notes about like another passenger, but they don't name him. So I thought, okay, I will take that and make that my main character, so it can be like this fly on the wall in this coach where these two great men are having this conversation, and he worked it into the plot.
Specifically the type of story that you're writing here is called the secret history story. That is, and it's very, very common in people who want to go back and say, okay, well, vampires were real or whatever. There's a secret history of the world to where everyday life and history looks exactly like how we would expect it to be, but there's a secret history, and the novel explores and reveals that secret history, the true truth behind the events of the world. And so just about everybody in role-playing games who have some kind of alternate modern day life have to implement some form of secret history just to explain how, the fairies in the Middle Ages were real, but they've been underground and things like that. And then they very often come up with quite clever twists on, okay, well, this is how the one I'm thinking of right now, there was, and I don't remember the exact name of the role-playing game, so you'll have to apologize. Someone did a role-playing game that was basically Highlander, the movie, a role-playing game. And they went through in detail the world history and said, well, General Bernadette, who got hired to run a country, he was actually a Highlander, and he did all these things. And this other person off here who did all these strange things was actually, an immortal. They actually had lived for centuries and so on and so forth. And they did a very, very clever job of spinning their secret history. And it allows you to do some really, really cool things. The more that the audience already knows about real history, or the more you can clue them into real history, the more they can appreciate the tricks that you play with it.
Absolutely. Larry Korea's Monster Hunter series does the same thing. The White Wolf's Masquerade, right? The secret vampire history.
Darkness. They're always trying to figure out, okay, so what sort of clan or faction is this historical figure a member of?
One of my favorite examples of contemporary fiction that does this very well is Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, where it's set in what's ostensibly the present day, but there's a whole supernatural world that is not accessible or not noticed by us mere mortals. And it's effectively the same thing that Larry Correia does in Monster Hunter.
Yeah, exactly. And Nathan Housley in the chat is pointing out that one of the most fun things to do with these little tweaks to history is exploring the unintended consequences, like a Black Swan event, and then kind of trying to reconcile that with the historical record or not. Have you ever had any involvement with that? Ever run into anything like that?
I've got a question, because this is kind of interesting. Other than the ones you've pointed out where you did research into the background of electromagnetic science, are there any other historical events that just jumped up and down and shouted out to be incorporated into your secret history?
Well, actually, yes, because there's a very long backstory to my secret history. In my second book, there's an elaborate quasi-mythological story about the Shaolin monks of China, and how in the late 1600s, a group of these monks were asked by the emperor to save the empire from an invasion. And so they went out and saved the emperor and saved the empire. The brave band of some 120 or so warrior monks who took on an army many times their size, and through their sophisticated learning and knowledge and martial skill were able to defeat the enemy. And then once they had emerged victorious, their teacher wanted to take over the empire, and the monks refused and wanted to go back to their monastery and study. So their teacher bided his time and then whispered in the emperor's ear to convince the emperor that the monks were conspiring against him and were a danger to him, and got the emperor to launch a surprise raid with overwhelming forces to wipe out the monastery. Well, then there were only a handful of survivors, and they fought a rebellion against the emperor and ultimately failed, and had to go separate ways to build their strength for the eventual future restoration of the correct rule and lineage in China. And that is actually the origin story for most Chinese tongs or secret societies. Many of them regard themselves as the descendants of those monks. So I wove that quasi-mythological historical background into the novel as well, as kind of the previous step before the events that were taking place in the 1800s.
See, and there is a difference between an alternate history and a secret history. In an alternate history, I mean, Harry Turtledove, right, is the master, obviously. He's written tons of books, and he has a couple of tricks that he uses to do them, but still he does alternate history books where X and such an event changed, and because of that change, the world today is remarkably different, yet strangely similar. And so that is an alternate history novel, is where, what if the South had won the Civil War? It's really, really common one in American alternate history or allohistorical writing. A secret history is almost the inverse of that, where you assume that everything happened the way it did up to a certain point. You could say, well, JFK was president, he was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson became president, we increased our presence in Vietnam, Nixon became president, yada, yada, yada. All the historical events were the same, and yet behind it all, you find out that the Vietnam War was really a battle between two clans of superhuman cannibals, ghouls versus vampires or something. And so you write a novel set in Vietnam where the North Vietnamese are ghouls and the South Vietnamese are ruled by vampires. That's a secret history novel if that doesn't cause a change in politics past the Vietnam War. So yours is a secret history novel up until basically the Florida election or the Florida recount when Al Gore becomes president instead of George W. Bush, and then you veer into an alternate history for like the last decade or so.
Exactly, yes.
Now that's subtle genre blending. Good job.
So did you have any hints or tips for people who want to do this sort of thing in their novels?
Oh, well, it really just requires having a good background and familiarity with the actual historical events. You just have to know a lot more about it than your typical reader. And the trick is to make 90% of it exactly, absolutely verifiable in history. And one of the fun things you do is look at some of the most improbable things that actually happened historically and figure out how you can set them up with made up, fictional, very pedestrian things that are eminently believable. And then you spring the peculiar coincidence on people. And that's the thing that they go and they take a look, and they Google it, and lo, there it is, and there it is in history. And I've had a number of readers who have been deeply surprised at some of the coincidences that I point out. Like, for instance, part of the background of my story is that the preferred method of assassination by the conspiracy, at least up through the discovery of radioactive materials in the around 1900, they would just inject someone with a radioactive poison and let them develop cancer. So all of these Maxwell and Fitzgerald both suffered from stomach cancer or abdominal upsets. Hertz suffered from a kind of jaw malignancy, and it turns out that the German Kaiser had a very similar jaw, or I think larynx cancer, just a year or two before Hertz's. And because he had that cancer, he only reigned for 90 days, and instead of his more benign rule, we ended up with Kaiser Wilhelm and World War I. So that made a really great turning point that I could ascribe to the function of the conspiracy. So really, it's a matter of looking into the historical events or the historical period you're interested in and cherry picking some of the most interesting, improbable, unlikely, and fascinating events, and then constructing a coherent narrative that weaves them together.
If I could make a recommendation to the audience, if you have a sec, I would recommend GURPS 3rd edition book called Timeline. It's $7.99 at the GURPS PDF website. It is a listing of history from the Big Bang up until Desert Storm, because 1990, 1991, which is when the book was published. But what it has is a broad overview of history, including a lot of critical events that could easily have gone one way or the other to change history totally, and then discusses how to apply that to make stuff happen differently. So it's a great introduction to alternate history. It's a great introduction to some key moments in time that you can use to plot out an alternate history. And it also talks about how to extrapolate them. It talks about the several models of extrapolation. Like, there's one model of extrapolation that is like the butterfly effect. You change one tiny small thing and everything is completely different. There's another model which is, celebrities always reappear, right? So you change something, and like aliens invade during World War II. This is a Harry Turtledove series. Aliens invade during World War II, but in the 1960s, Martin Luther King is still a prominent figure, and other people in the 1960s are still a prominent figure, 20 years after aliens have invaded. In reality, would that happen? Probably not, but it makes for great books, and we're not talking about reality anyway when we're talking about changing history. And let me give you an example of what Hans was just talking about. At one point in the wars between England and Spain, the English managed a huge victory over the Spanish Armada and sunk quite a lot of it. Now, again, I'm remembering this from a decade ago, so if those of you who are historians, if I have made errors in summarizing it or whatever, please forgive me. In any case, the reason why this could happen is because there were storm winds blowing from England towards Spain, blowing and blowing and blowing and blowing and blowing, which slowed the Spanish fleet from being able to deploy for weeks. For weeks, these winds blew as the Spanish fleet tried to make its way up to England. And just when the Spanish fleet was going to turn around and get out of there, the winds instantly shifted to the exact opposite direction and blew and blew and blew and blew and prevented the Spanish from moving very, very quickly. So the weather itself seemed to conspire to get the Spanish fleet sunk. Now, if you take that event and even change that just slightly, let's say you made it more plausible where that didn't happen, the Spanish might have won and England might have been conquered. You can go any one of a number of different ways there, or if not conquered, invaded, and you'd have a large Spanish presence, a Spanish kingdom in the south of England, whatever you wanted to do with that. But that is an example of several things that happen in reality, in the real world, that really happened, that seem so completely bizarrely out of place, so completely bizarrely strange, that you can build just about anything you want into making an alternate history, and it will be less bizarre than history itself. I'll pause and allow my good friend and host, Mr. Niemeyer, to comment.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of the Spanish Armada. And also Bradford Walker in the chat points out that a term for what you're talking about with history changing, but celebrities always reappearing is sticky history, right? It's where you pick certain things that are hard to change, and they almost become like focal points or axis points everything else can revolve around. So yeah, that GURPS module sounds like an excellent resource.
Let me tell you what I've done, folks. I have put a link to Mr. Schantz's Amazon page in the description beneath the video. I'll also include a link to the Warehouse 23 page for GURPS Timeline for those of you who want to check it out. And again, it's $7.99. It's $8 as a PDF. And for those of you who want to write alternate histories but aren't sure where to start, it's a great basic introduction to it, and I would recommend it.
Yeah, wasn't that a Doctor Who concept too? Oh yeah, Bradford Walker just mentioned it in the chat. Fixed point in time.
Oh, he used Johnny on the spot today.
At least one of us is paying attention.
So let me ask you a question. Once you have selected, and yours was fairly recently, so you didn't have to make a ton of big changes. But for people who want to make changes further back, how would they go about developing that into a coherent alternate history?
Well, that is a very good question, because the whole linear interpolation model of tomorrow is going to look a lot like today, only more so in some characteristic. That obviously breaks down if you try to extrapolate it too far ahead. There's a general recognition that there are cycles in history, and a lot of different models and theories and interpretations of how those cycles work. One of, I think, the most useful is, I haven't seen a name for this, but I like to think of it as the 4-cycle model. And that's the basic idea that strong men create good times create weak men create bad times, and then bad times create strong men. So you have cycles of heroic, hardworking people creating a successful and prosperous society, and then a period in which there are hedonistic excesses and everyone gets lazy and forgets the morals and ideals that made their success possible, leading to a collapse. And then from that collapse or setback, you have people arising through the difficulties to create a new equilibrium at hopefully a higher level. There's a little more scientific approach to that a gentleman named Jim Penman came up with. He called it biohistory. And he characterizes history using a couple parameters. C for civilization, how well the culture is civilized, willing to accept a loyalty to higher ideals, to a constitution, to distant leaders, rather than local, tribal, or clan or family ties. The other axis he has is vigor, how warlike or aggressive the society is. So you can do that. Good times, bad times, strong men, weak men on that. He would call that the C and V axes. It's a real fascinating theory that he ties into epigenetics and tries to explain how the conditions under which one generation lives tend to influence future generations. He does a lot of analogies looking through Chinese history and through our more limited recent history, for instance, claiming that World War II is in essence an echo of the stresses suffered during World War I. So it's an interesting framework to try to extrapolate future histories off of. And in fact, you see a lot of future histories, like Heinlein's future history was very much in that spirit, where Heinlein, from his perspective in the 1940s, was predicting that in a generation or two, we would have what he called the crazy years, where there would be all kinds of aberrant behaviors and wild hedonism and breaking of conventional social standards. And then he predicted that out of that chaos would arise a strong man.
Sounds like we might have
taken still order and so forth. So that's an example of that in science fiction.
One of the things that I don't remember if it's in GURPS Timeline. I think it was in GURPS Timeline, but again, I'm remembering something that I last read well over a decade ago. Is that they point out that the number of improbable events in history is improbably large. That in point of fact, history usually goes in bizarre and weird ways that people don't expect. And so if your goal is to have a specific historical setup, a specific outcome to your alternate history, then all you need to do is construct a sort of semi-plausible series of events that lead up to it, because no matter how unrealistic it may seem, as long as you're sticking within the bounds of what's physically possible in your universe, it's going to be almost certainly less unlikely, less unrealistic than reality itself. Reality is significantly more unrealistic than just about any piece of fiction is allowed to be. But as long as you're coming in under the strangeness that the real world implements, then you don't really have to worry about whether or not you're extrapolating things rigorously. I mean, let me just give one quick example that verges on politics, or that is about politics, but I want to use it as an example because it's the strangest one I can think of in recent history. Who would have thought a decade ago that a cartoon frog that began as a character in a comic strip, a left-wing comic strip, would get picked up as a bizarre mascot by a vast array of people on a tiny little corner of the internet, and then that cartoon frog would get spread all over the internet because of some other events completely unconnected from it, and then it would get picked up and used by supporters of one presidential candidate, to where another presidential candidate would hold an entire press conference decrying the use of this cartoon frog. Now, I don't want you to think about those specific series of events, but think about those events as a prototype, as a pattern for how history influences later, event A influences event B, influences event C, and none of them are linear extrapolations. Linear extrapolations of history are almost always wrong. History goes in unexpected directions. So if what you want to do is to create a plausible alternate history, all you need to do is come up with a series of explicable events, research your history enough to be able to explain why things went that way, be ready to tweak it if you find facts that, you know, go against your first impression. But that's all you need to do to get an alternate history off the ground. Just keep in mind that history bends in strange ways, and you don't have to go in a straight line extrapolation. In fact, straight line extrapolations are almost never how the real world operates.
Well, yeah, to some extent, I would agree with you, certainly on the level of the particulars and the details in the history. But I think in terms of the broad currents, that's not necessarily going to be the case. Like, I think if you tried to make a future history where a decade from now there'd be the country would be ruled by a king, and there'd be a medieval style aristocracy and something like that.
There's a future history by, oh dang it, S.M. Sterling, where there is a strange event that kills high technology across the planet, and one of the people who takes power is a history professor who deliberately styles his army after medieval laws, medieval social mores, and then because he knows how to make medieval weaponry, he's well prepared for the situation he finds himself in, and his army begins expanding and conquering a wide range of territory. So it may be that that would rule the entire country, but given an improbable enough event, you can actually justify that.
You could, but that's a bit of a deus ex machina, not something that you would expect from the usual. Well, I guess you could just call that your black swan event, that no one was expecting technology to stop working. But if you want to make your future history, or the history that you are employing in your futuristic science fiction realistic, the easiest technique is to take real life, real world human history, file the names and the numbers off of it, and turn it into a story. For instance, Asimov's Foundation was just taking the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and setting it in space. And there are any number of people who do that. Like the Napoleonic Wars are a real popular historical period that people have taken and adapted to space. David Weber's Honor Harrington series, or more recently, there's been a fascinating series by E.C. Williams called Westerly Gales. What he does in that series is assume there is a post-apocalyptic civilization a few centuries from now that has managed to survive on the Kerguelen Islands in the Indian Ocean. And they've retained certain elements of modern technology, but a lot of what they do is sail around in sailing ships, and he uses that as a basis for some Horatio Hornblower style naval adventures.
One of the things to keep in mind is that natural events have a far more subtle impact on history than we sometimes appreciate. During the 1800s, there was a series of solar flares that burned out telegraph wires across the country, that caused a great deal of disruption and damage. If those same solar flares happened today, it would basically be the equivalent of a planetary EMP. It would literally, destroy electronics, our internet communication systems, smartphones, all of that stuff, radios, fried. And so we would be thrown back on communications technology and things like that of, early last century. All of the modern automobiles would no longer be able to function because their computer chips would be burned out, and we would be thrown back on cars and trucks that don't have that, and we'd have to start manufacturing from there. So there's a historical event that happened in the 1800s. If it happened 100 years later, boom, instant technological scythe, or a scythe that destroyed modern technology. In times past, there have been weather events like, for example, in the early 1800s, there was a worldwide collapse in temperatures, which forced a lot of people to migrate from one place to another to get to better farmland. And that had a subtle but powerful effect on history. Let me give you one example. Was Joseph Smith, who founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, moved to New York. His family moved to New York because of that drop in temperatures. And obviously that changed American history in a subtle but pervasive way. And so if what you want to do is to get to a specific point, there are lots of things available to you that can cause chaos. There are volcanic eruptions that can either, destroy a large part of the world, kill a large part of the world, or just disrupt a small part of it. Dang it, I'm going to say the wrong author, and I'm also going to say the wrong series names. There is a book series about a meteor strike that wiped out Northern Europe, and the culture that survived was the Indian subcontinent being ruled by a British overclass, and they, that it set a couple of 100 years after that event, and it's kind of a steampunk book, and I'm sure somebody in the chat's gonna be able to come up with a series. It's a steampunk style series, but that's where it veers off, is that meteor strike. So there are meteor strikes, there are volcanic eruptions, there are sudden, if the planetary heat increases or planetary heat decreases, all of those things can cause things that that would otherwise be improbable. And we were talking earlier about how hard times create tough men and stuff. Well, one of the things that influenced the World War II generation, the generation that fought World War II, was the drought, was the Great Dust Bowl in the 30s that brought a lot of privation to people. So if what you want is, instead of, let's say, in the 1960s, instead of the hippie movement becoming so big, instead of counterculture becoming so big, you introduce an epidemic that devastates the population, that will take it in an entirely different direction. So whatever model of history you want to use, there's a wide range of historical events that are real that can change things in big ways or small ways to get exactly what you like. Oh, Peshawar Lancers. Thank you to the chat. The Peshawar Lancers books were based on what I was talking about with India, with a British overclass. And Harry Turtledove, what he does is exactly what, again, Hans was talking about. He takes real history and transposes it. He's got a series of books called, I think the first one was Joe Steele, where he takes the rise of Stalin, the history of Stalin, the personalities around Stalin, the events that allowed him to take control in the Soviet Union, and just transplants it to the United States, where he assumes that Joe Stalin, literally Joe Stalin, the actual historical personage of Joe Stalin, immigrated to America, or his parents immigrated to America, and he builds an entire alternate history off of photocopying the historical events. So if you look at most Terry Turtledove books, that's how he tends to build things, is photocopy historical events and put them either in different geographical places or different parts of the timeline to build his alternate histories.
And it's been effective.
Oh, and it also helps that he's a really, really good author.
It does help.
So in fact, I think the coolest series that I haven't read yet that I want to read is The United States of Atlantis.
The title alone sold me just now.
Yeah, I just got a picture in my mind, and it's pretty awesome.
Isn't it?
I mean, unless you're talking about some Aquaman book, then it's probably not so great.
All right, we are running out of time, so let's let our guests have some time before we go.
Oh, sure. One final point I wanted to make is how, the cyclical nature of scientific discovery, because a lot of the future technology that people extrapolate is based on linear interpolation from what we have, and there's a whole set of science fiction tropes, like various methods of faster than light travel, for instance, that are really common. What you see as you look at the history of science is cycling from periods where fundamental discoveries are being made, and then into a period where those discoveries are being explored and extrapolated and their consequences worked out, and elaborate mathematical models being constructed to explain what's going on. So you can look at Aristotelian physics, where Aristotle concluded that terrestrial motion is linear and celestial motion is circular. And his successors took that as axiomatic, as akin to the axioms of Euclidean geometry, and started working out the consequences and came up with all of these superpositions of circular motions to explain the geocentric model of the solar system. Well, then people started making more accurate measurements, started applying more sophisticated models like ellipses instead of circles, and finally Newton took all that and came up with fundamental new breakthroughs on the laws of motion and on gravity. But then a century or so after that, it was back to treating those as being fundamental, obvious axioms and working out all the mathematical consequences. And you ended up with very elaborate action at a distance theories to explain how not just gravity, but also electricity and magnetism worked. Well, then Faraday came up with the idea of fields, the idea that there is some mechanism surrounding these charges and currents that give rise to the effects of electromagnetics. And that's the idea that Maxwell and his successors, the people I've been talking about, Hertz and Fitzgerald and Oliver Lodge and some other people like that, took and ran with to work out our modern theory of electromagnetics. But since that time, it's gone off, particularly through quantum mechanics, into a very counterintuitive set of mathematical models that allow us to predict what's happening, but have ideas that are every bit as confusing and counterintuitive as the notion of instantaneous action at a distance was back in Faraday's time. So trying to extrapolate the course of technology, it's interesting to try to imagine what might be the more common sense basis that explains what's going on in quantum mechanics and would give you a basis for developing a future technology. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in my series as well.
One of the things to keep in mind for people who are building an alternate history, I don't think we have enough time for it. We might have to do that on another show. Yeah, we need to taper off here, not jump into a whole new subject. So I'll have to do that at another show. Okay. Thank you for coming on. We have links to your website, to your Amazon page, and to GURPS Timeline, all in the underneath the video, as well as links, of course, to Brian's website, his books, and to my articles on the Castalia House website. John, Brian, do you guys have anything else to say before we take off?
I'm good. Hey, thanks for joining us, Mr. Schantz. It was great talking to you.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to maybe doing it again sometime if you'll have me on.
Yeah, we'd love to. I'd also like to thank Hans for coming on. And I do want to remind our listeners that for Halloween, my breakout horror sci-fi novel Ethereal is only 99 cents for Kindle. And the other two books, Soul Dancer and Secret Kings, are also on sale. So you can get the whole Soul Cycle right now for less than $9.
All right, folks, thanks for tuning in to Geek Gab. We are out of here. We have got our address for those of you who need to know. It's youtube.com/geekgab. And be sure if you come to the channel to subscribe. In fact, double secret subscribe by clicking on the little bell icon so you get the notifications of when the show is going live. You can come and participate in the chat. We've had a very, very lively chat, some great suggestions on books that you can read. One suggestion we did have, I want to pass along before we go, is from Nathan Housley, talking about Eric Flint's 1812 and 1824. And in the author's notes for those books, he describes how to build alternate histories, methods to build alternate history. So in addition to GURPS Timeline, you can check out those two novels and get some tips on how to build alternate histories for your own role-playing background or your own novels. So, again, lots and lots of things like that come up in the chat. Very, very informative, especially on days like today. So, by all means, double secret subscribe so you get the announcements. You can come and participate live. In addition, we're not just available on YouTube. We are available on the Google Play Store. We are available on the iTunes Store. And we are available at SoundCloud.com. Just do a search for Geek Gab, and you can get us on any of those places. We are freely available on your Android device or freely available on your iOS device. And if you want to strike a blow against the corporate overloads, you can just download the MP3 file at SoundCloud.com. Thanks for tuning in today, folks. We are out of here, but don't you worry, don't you fret. We will be back.